File 4.
My uncle was exceedingly anxious to know what I was about to do, but my fears of raising false hopes prevented me from telling him. I was back in my own consulting-room a little after luncheon, and was confirming my memory of a passage in a recent book upon occultism which had arrested my attention when I read it. "In the case of earth-bound spirits," said my authority, "some one dominant idea obsessing them at the hour of death is sufficient to hold them in this material world. They are the amphibia of this life and of the next, capable of passing from one to the other as the turtle passes from land to water. The causes which may bind a soul so strongly to a life which its body has abandoned are any violent emotion. Avarice, revenge, anxiety, love, and pity have all been known to have this effect. As a rule, it springs from some unfulfilled wish, and when the wish has been fulfilled, the material bond relaxes. There are many cases upon record which show the singular persistence of these visitors, and also their disappearance when their wishes have been fulfilled, or in some cases when a reasonable compromise has been effected." A reasonable compromise effected. Those were the words which I had brooded over all the morning, and which I now verified in the original. No actual atonement could be made here, but a reasonable compromise. I made my way as fast as the train could take me to the Shadwell Seamen's Hospital, where my old friend Jack Hewitt was house surgeon. Without explaining the situation, I made him understand what it was that I wanted. "A brown man's hand?" said he in amazement. "What in the world do you want that for?" "Never mind, I'll tell you some day. I know that your wards are full of Indians." "I should think so, but a hand—" He thought a little, and then struck a bell. "Travers," said he to a student dresser, "what became of the hands of the lascar which we took off yesterday? I mean the fellow from the East India dock who got caught in the steam winch." "They are in the post-mortem room, sir." "Just pack one of them in antiseptics and give it to Dr. Hardacre." And so I found myself back at Rodenhurst before dinner with this curious outcome of my day in town. I still said nothing to Sir Dominick, but I slept that night in the laboratory, and I placed the lascar's hand in one of the glass jars at the end of my couch. So interested was I in the result of my experiment that sleep was out of the question. I sat with a shaded lamp beside me and waited patiently for my visitor. This time I saw him clearly from the first. He appeared beside the door, nebulous for an instant, and then hardening into a distinct an outline as any living man. The slippers beneath his grey gown were red and heelless, which accounted for the low, shuffling sound which he made as he walked. As on the previous night, he passed slowly along the line of bottles until he paused before that which contained the hand. He reached up to it, his whole figure quivering with expectation, took it down, examined it eagerly, and then, with a face which was convulsed with fury and disappointment, he hurled it down on the floor. There was a crash which resounded through the house, and when I looked up, the mutilated Indian had disappeared. A moment later my door flew open, and Sir Dominick rushed in. "You are not hurt?" he cried. "No, but deeply disappointed." He looked in astonishment at the splinters of glass and the brown hand lying upon the floor. "Good God!" he cried. "What is this?" I told him my idea and its wretched sequel. He listened intently, but shook his head. "It is well thought of," said he, "but I fear that there is no such easy end to my sufferings. But one thing I now insist upon. It is that you shall never again upon any pretext occupy this room. My fears that something might have happened to you when I heard that crash have been the most acute of all my agonies which I have undergone. I will not expose myself to a repetition of it." He allowed me, however, to spend the remainder of that night where I was, and I lay there worrying over the problem and lamenting my own failure. With the first light of morning there was the Lascar's hand still lying upon the floor to remind me of my fiasco. I lay looking at it, and as I lay, suddenly an idea flew like a bullet through my head and brought me quivering with excitement out of my couch. I raised the grim relic from where it had fallen. Yes, it was indeed so. The hand was the left hand of the Lascar. By the first train I was on my way to town, and hurried at once to the Seamen's Hospital. I remembered that both hands of the Lascar had been amputated, but I was terrified lest the precious organ which I was in search of might have been already consumed in the crematory. My suspense was soon ended. It had still been preserved in the post-mortem room, and so I returned to Rodenhurst in the evening with my mission accomplished and the material for a fresh experiment. But Sir Dominick Holden would not hear of my occupying the laboratory again. To all my entreaties he turned a deaf ear. It offended his sense of hospitality, and he could no longer permit it. I left the hand, therefore, as I had done its fellow the night before, and I occupied a comfortable bedroom in another portion of the house, some distance from the scene of my adventures. But in spite of that, my sleep was not destined to be uninterrupted. In the dead of night my host burst into my room, a lamp in his hand. His huge, gaunt figure was enveloped in a loose dressing-gown, and his whole appearance might certainly have seemed more formidable to a weak-nerved man than that of the Indian of the night before. But it was not his entrance so much as his expression which amazed me. He had turned suddenly younger by 20 years at the least. His eyes were shining, his features radiant, and he waved one hand in triumph over his head. I sat up, astounded, staring sleepily at this extraordinary visitor. But his words soon drove the sleep from my eyes. "We have done it! We have succeeded!" he shouted. "My dear Hardacre, how can I ever in this world repay you?" "You don't mean to say that it is all right?" "Indeed I do. I am sure that you would not mind being awakened to hear such blessed news." "Mind? I should think not indeed. But is it really certain?" "I have no doubt whatever upon the point. I owe you such a debt, my dear nephew, as I have never owed a man before, and never expected to. What can I possibly do for you that is commensurate? Providence must have sent you to my rescue. You have saved both my reason and my life, for another 6 months of this must have seen me either in a cell or a coffin. And my wife, it was wearing her out before my eyes. Never could I have believed that any human being could have lifted this burden off me." He seized my hand and wrung it in his bony grip. "It was only an experiment, a forlorn hope, but I am delighted from my heart that it has succeeded. But how do you know that it is all right? Have you seen something?" He seated himself at the foot of my bed. "I have seen enough," said he. "It satisfies me that I shall be troubled no more. What has passed is easily told. You know that at a certain hour this creature always comes to me. Tonight he arrived at the usual time, and aroused me with even more violence than his custom. I can only surmise that his disappointment of last night increased the bitterness of his anger against me. He looked angrily at me, and then went on his usual round. But in a few minutes I saw him, for the first time since this persecution began, return to my chamber. He was smiling. I saw the gleam of his white teeth through the dim light. He stood facing me at the end of my bed, and 3 times he made the low Eastern salaam, which is their solemn leave-taking. And the 3rd time that he bowed, he raised his arms over his head, and I saw his 2 hands outstretched in the air. So he vanished, and, as I believe, forever." So that is the curious experience which won me the affection and the gratitude of my celebrated uncle, the famous Indian surgeon. His anticipations were realized, and never again was he disturbed by the visits of the restless hillman in search of his lost member. Sir Dominick and Lady Holden spent a very happy old age, unclouded, so far as I know, by any trouble, and they finally died during the great influenza epidemic within a few weeks of each other. In his lifetime he always turned to me for advice in everything which concerned that English life of which he knew so little, and I aided him also in the purchase and development of his estates. It was no great surprise to me, therefore, that I found myself eventually promoted over the heads of 5 exasperated cousins, and changed in a single day from a hard-working country doctor into the head of an important Wiltshire family. I at least have reason to bless the memory of the man with the brown hand, and the day when I was fortunate enough to relieve Rodenhurst of his unwelcome presence.